Liberal Fox News commentator Jessica Tarlov once again triggered her four MAGA co-hosts into a full-blown live TV meltdown with a brutal fact check about right-wing political violence, even as we learn disturbing new details about the recent Cybertruck explosion in Las Vegas and the fact that the perpetrator believed that violence should be used to purge Democrats from the country. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a lot to talk about here. And we're going to start with Jessica Tarlov, who, again, is a friend of the show, somebody that I met at the DNC. I'm a big fan of hers. I think she has the hardest job in legacy media, going into a right-wing network which is so dishonest that it recently had to pay $800 million in an effective loyalty tithe to Donald Trump for signal-boosting lies about the 2020 election. But she goes in and wages a righteous crusade on behalf of liberalism and progressivism, mixing it up with four MAGA co-hosts. She is outnumbered 4-1 in every episode. And despite the heckling and the interruption and the cherry picking and the bad faith and the fact that she is surrounded by hostility in terms of her political views, right? Hostility to her political views, she just kicks ass. She's so good at what she does. And you should also subscribe, by the way, to her podcast that she co-hosts with Professor Scott Galloway, called The Raging Moderates. It's worth your time. Now, having said that, in this particular clip, what you're going to confront is additional evidence that the right and MAGA and the Republican Party really aren't the facts don't care about your feelings side of the political spectrum, because as there have been some recent stories involving potential political violence, potential acts of terrorism, there are questions about, left-wing terrorism versus right-wing terrorism, and Jessica Tarlov shuts that shit down with stats, figures, facts, and figures, and her four co-hosts can't handle it.
But the reason that President Biden and the administration and Christopher Wray, who was a Trump appointee, have been talking about the threat of right-wingers and far right-wing supremacy, whatever you want to call it, is because that's what the numbers bear out. And we put up all those numbers about how many people had been killed by jihadists, but it's not as many as those who have been killed by white supremacists. So the New America Foundation has done a breakdown in terrorist attacks since 9/11. It goes through 2023. We have to add the 2024 numbers once they're available, but you have 134 killed by far right-wingers, 107 killed by jihadists, 17 killed by misogynists or incels, 13 killed by black separatists or nationalists, and 1 killed by
killed by gang members.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to be on the list.
Okay,
That's a
killed
phenomenal
by
number.
illegals.
That's-
Let's add to the list.
Those are
I wonder how many of
listen,
those killed by white supremacists were killed in prison.
Look,
died by
say,
suicide. I mean, because oftentimes they.
how many people fell off an ice cream truck?
You brought the numbers up. I mean, you're countering the numbers that are very obvious.
No, we're not.
From
First
terrorist
of all,
attacks.
Yes, they have their definition of a terrorist attack. They have the ideologies behind these terror attacks. I am not here to minimize any. You do know? Great. We'll tell the rest of the table.
I don't think you're minimizing it, but
I'm just saying that the numbers don't. But it does.
Think the argument holds.
Okay, then you should speak to the New America Foundation.
I don't think the numbers are accurate.
Well, what numbers do you
first
have
of all,
encountered?
you're talking about post 9/11.
Right.
I mean, the
what do you want
numbers
to
that
talk
we
about? You
have
wanna go back
is,
to World
first
War
of all, no, is 2015 in terms of ISIS. These are the only numbers that we have collected. You want to go back to 2011? We can go back to that number.
Well, I want to go back.
So you hear, I mean, it just they know that if you're talking about political violence from right-wingers, and by the way, I would argue that religious fundamentalists, that is a form of right-wing political violence. It's an act of extreme fundamentalist religious conservatism, be it Islamic jihadists, Christian terrorists, whatever. If you are so religiously conservative that you are motivated to attack political violence, that's a form of right-wing violence, of course, because I would argue there's a degree of racism and bigotry within the Republican Party that they want to carve out, religious fundamentalism as being fundamentally separate from right-wing violence, when I would argue you group it together. But Jessica Tarlov points out, even if you don't, right-wing political violence as separated from, religious fundamentalism, it's still more prevalent. And she points this out as well on Twitter. She goes, for the facts don't care about your feelings crowd, linking the source, New America. We'll look at it in just a second, but Do you see how her co-host felt the need to interrupt and to heckle? What about undocumented immigrants? What about gang violence? Jessica Tarlov's position is not that right-wing political violence constitutes the most prevalent form of violence, period. Of course not. But what she's saying is, if we're talking about acts of terror, which have political implications, right? Regular homicide or gang violence, there's no necessary political implication there. But if we're talking about terrorist attacks, which has political implications, then yes, it's much more represented on the right than the left. So what her four MAGA co-hosts did was try to move the goalpost, even though the subject was about political violence and acts of terrorism. What about, oh my God, we can't handle that. Gang violence. What about black on black crime? What about trans crime? They will do anything to avoid any sort of accountability for their side of the aisle, for their side of the political movement. But you can bet your ass that if the shoe were on the other foot, if left-wing political violence was represented in these figures, in this frequency, with this magnitude, those same MAGA co-hosts would be demanding that Jessica Tarlov and the Democratic Party writ large take some sort of accountability for that. Why is your side of the aisle so violent? But given that political violence is much more likely to be represented on the right than the left, they will do anything to distract and deflect. You see, they're visibly triggered by this into a full-blown meltdown. It's pathetic. It really is. And that's why, by the way, that when you see occasional instances of left-wing violence, and I say occasional because it is relatively speaking, which, by the way, it should also be condemned, the Republicans, Fox News, others pounce on it. At the same time, they demand that you don't pounce when there are acts of right-wing violence. No, we can't talk about that. We can't politicize that. Left-wing violence, yes, we can politicize that. We can talk about it. The double standards are so infuriating. But they know they lose the debate if you stick to single standards. That's why they move the goalpost. That's why they grade their own side on a curve. And that's why they stick their fingers in their ears and scream at the highest possible decibel in order to avoid confronting the facts. The source that Jessica Tarlov is talking about, again, newamerica.org, the political threat. The terrorist threat is from across the political spectrum. So again, it acknowledges that it's not exclusive to the right. It's just more represented by the right. So, again, great performance by Jessica Tarlov, but that's really not the end of the story. So Waja Ali, another friend of the show, a progressive commentator, says, has any Republican or MAGA leader been asked to condemn the violence and extremist ideology of Cybertruck terrorist Matt Leibelsberger? That's how it works for Muslims, so I'm just trying to be fair here. What's he talking about? Well, you may have heard about the Cybertruck explosion in Las Vegas outside a Trump hotel. We're learning more details about that attack, which wounded, I think, 7 people and killed the perpetrator, a former Green Beret. And we're going to watch this clip here as more information has been accumulated by the authorities, and we're actually going to read some more as well that isn't discussed in the clip.
New clues into why a Green Beret set off a homemade bomb outside of Trump Tower. Thanks for joining us here at 6 o'clock. I'm Heather Mills.
And I'm Ozzie Mora. Police and federal leaders telling us a 37-year-old Matthew Leibelsberger kept a digital journal and likely planned the New Year's Day bombing. 8 News Now investigator David Charnes following this every step of the way. He's live outside right now, the Tower Hotel.
Police and the FBI say that Matthew Leibelsberger wrote for about 10 days in that digital journal on his way here from Colorado Springs to the Trump Hotel, where he would eventually die by suicide and set off that car bomb. Those writings include things like saying Americans need to wake up, and they also need to, quote, rally behind President-elect Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And this is all leading the FBI to believe that this was planned and that he wanted to create some sort of big stunt for us all to see, which we now all have. Now, new video we received from police today shows Leibelsberger charging that Tesla that he would eventually explode in Kingman before the bombing. He's charging it there in Kingman. It is just one piece of new evidence, including photos and those writings that investigators found on his phone. Police say this video shows Leibelsberger walking around the car, soon to be full of fireworks and consumer explosives that he bought in New Mexico. Now, writings on that phone include frustration with the military, and one says this, quote, "Fellow service members, veterans, and all Americans, time to wake up. We are being led by weak and feckless leadership who only serve to enrich themselves." The FBI saying there is no known tie right now as to any reason why he chose the Trump hotel or was driving that Tesla.
Through these interviews, we've found that the subject held no animosity towards the president-elect. That's something that's also been reported. Investigative steps have discovered, and information from the Army indicates, that he likely suffered from PTSD, and we are also aware that there were potential other family issues or personal grievances in his own life that may have been contributing factors. Again, we're looking into all of that.
So, you might think, okay, well, some of that's pretty disturbing. Is there more? Yes, in fact, there is. One note, which KLAS reported police confirmed, was left behind on a note-taking application. Leibelsberger allegedly wrote, "Fellow service members, veterans, and all Americans, time to wake up. We're being led by weak and feckless leadership who only serve to enrich themselves. Military and vets move on DC starting now. Militias facilitate and augment this activity. Occupy every major road along Fed buildings and the campus of Fed buildings by the hundreds of thousands. Lock the highways down with semis right after everybody gets in. Hold until the purge is complete. Try peaceful means first, but be prepared to fight to get the Dems out of the federal government and the military by any means necessary. They all must go, and a hard reset must occur for our country to avoid collapse." Matt Leibelsberger. Leibelsberger praised President-elect Donald Trump and Trump allies Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Elon Musk. He also wrote critically of President Biden, Vice President Harris, and DEI initiatives. The full and unedited message reads, "We are the United States of America, the best country, people to ever exist. But right now, we are terminally ill and headed towards collapse. We are crumbling because of a lack of self-respect, morals, and respect for others. Greed and gluttony has consumed us. The top 1% decided long ago they weren't going to bring everyone else with them. You are cattle to them." Again, think about the warped mind it takes to believe these things and also simultaneously support Elon Musk, the world's richest man, who is an unelected MAGA oligarch, puppeteering Donald Trump, another billionaire, whatever. We have strayed from family values and corrupted our minds, and I'm a prime example of having it all, but it never being enough. Again, imagine being an open Trump supporter, complaining about how the American people have strayed from family values, a pathological liar, somebody who has committed multiple infidelities. He's a notorious philanderer. He paid a porn star to be quiet about an affair they had while his most recent wife was at home with their youngest son. Not exactly a beacon of family values, but they don't care about consistency. A lot of us are just sitting around waiting to die. No sunlight, no steps, no fresh air, no hope. Our bodies are addicted to screens by the age of 2. We are filling our bodies with processed foods. Our population is too fat to join the military, yet we're facing a war with China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran before 2030. We must take these actions if we're going to make it past the next few years in one piece. We must end the war in Ukraine with negotiated settlement. It's the only way. Focus on strength and winning. Masculinity is good, and men must be leaders. Strength is a deterrent, and fear is the product. Weed it out. Those in our government and military who do not idealize number 2, talking about how masculinity is good and men must be leaders. Presumably, women cannot be, and we need to invoke fear in others. So if you don't believe that, you should be weeded out of the government and military. The income inequality in this country and cost of living is outrageous. Again, so that means support somebody who's on track to become the world's first trillionaire, who is unelected and effectively puppeteering our government. Again, very strange stuff. The number of homeless on our streets is embarrassing and disgusting. Have some pride and take care of this. Stop obsessing over diversity. We are all diverse, and DEI is a cancer. Thankfully, we rejected the DEI candidate, and we will have a real president instead of Weekend at Bernie's. Again, pretty racist dog whistling towards Vice President Harris and implying that Donald Trump is a beacon of mental health and whatever. We must move on from the culture of weakness and self-enrichment perpetuated by our senior political and military leaders. We are done with the blatant corruption. What? We just elevated blatant corruption. We've just made blatant corruption so much more blatant by re-electing Donald Trump and the real de facto shadow president, unelected MAGA billionaire Elon Musk. This is not a terrorist attack. It was a wake-up call. Americans only pay attention to spectacles and violence. What better way to get my point across than with a stunt from fireworks and explosives? Why did I personally do it now? I needed to cleanse my mind of the brothers I've lost and relieve myself of the burden of the lives I took. Consider this the last sunset of 24 and my actions, the end of our sickness and a new chapter of health for our people. Rally around the Trump, Musk, Kennedy, and ride this wave to the highest hegemony for all Americans. We are second to no one. So, again, pretty dangerously incendiary, violent rhetoric against Democrats. That's pretty alarming, isn't it? Where's the backlash to this? Where are elected Republicans speaking out against this, condemning this? They haven't. We also recently learned that the FBI seized its largest cache of homemade explosives in the history at a Virginia home, and the suspect, Brad Spafford, was using, according to neighbors and witnesses, President Biden, photos of President Biden for target practice at the local shooting range. The neighbor told the authorities that Spafford was using photos of President Biden for target practice at a local shooting range. The neighbor said Spafford believed that, quote, political assassination should be brought back, and that, quote, missing children in the news had been taken by the federal government to be trained as school shooters, end quote. After Trump was nearly assassinated in July at a Pennsylvania rally, Spafford allegedly told his neighbor, quote, that he hoped, quote, he hoped the shooter doesn't miss Kamala. This is incredibly dangerous, incredibly incendiary, and we should have single standards on this. So if the right, as they often do, expect the Democrats to vociferously condemn attacks on the right, which they pretty much do, certainly elected Democrats are very quick to speak up and show grace and to the subject or the victims of attacks against the right. So like Donald Trump, for example, President Biden, Vice President Harris, Nancy Pelosi, every elected Democrat that I can think of, if they commented on it at all, spoke in Trump's defense, sent him condolences and thoughts and prayers and condemned the violence. Meanwhile, when attacks are made against left-wing subjects or Democrats, Republicans very often don't comment at all and very often mock and celebrate it. Look at the attempted assassination or attempted attack on Nancy Pelosi that resulted in her husband, Paul Pelosi, who was not a politician. Not that that would make it okay, but he's not a politician. He's simply married to one. He was nearly killed. Donald Trump Jr., and right-wingers everywhere made fun of it. They mocked it. So it's just the inconsistent standard which really drives me nuts. And the fact of the matter is that the facts don't care about your feelings crowd have a really hard time reconciling the fact that political violence is much more likely to be represented on the right than the left. If you're a right-winger and you don't like that, then maybe you all should get your house in order. Maybe you should police other right-wingers and work to create a culture that doesn't glorify violence. Maybe it's on you to make your side of the aisle less violent. Food for thought. Anyway, great, masterful performance by Jessica Tarlov, which triggered her co-hosts. And in the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.